Miriam Kivlehan from Ireland, political activist and a political advisor and writer, and Fabiane Lima from Brazil, who's a radical feminist and writer. When feminists defend women's sex-based rights, we are accused of being aligned with or even funded by the religious right wing. Is this a new thing, or have we seen it before with other issues?
It's quite an interesting question, particularly in an Irish context, which in many ways might be different from some of the other Western or Western English speaking countries. So I might talk about it from an Irish perspective. And I would have to say pretty categorically that in everything that feminism has done in Ireland, it has had to collude with the right, because the only systems and governance systems we have had for the last 100 years have been right-wing political organizations and systems. So in how people understand right and left, we don't have a left-wing political structure in Ireland like you would have in many two-party situations where there's a clear right and there's a clear left. So maybe going back to the formation of the state 100 years ago, and when Ireland started, first of all, during the revolutionary years, we would have been very much, I suppose, aligned in terms of feminism with what was happening, obviously, in England, Scotland, Wales. So the suffrage movement and all of those would have moved parallel. Essentially, what happened then, we had our own civil war, where we had two parties, or two sides looking to seek power, to seize power. But ultimately, what the outcome of that is that we've ended up with two main majority political parties that are centre and right of centre. So we've never really had a left as would be known, we'll say, maybe coming from that kind of labour movement. And things were probably quite hopeful during the 20s in terms of the progression of women, in that it would have appeared with suffrage, and then we actually introduced universal suffrage in 1922, and it was a sort of maybe a statement of our sovereignty at that time from Britain, that we could introduce universal suffrage for women and dispense with things like the property requirements and that. So things looked quite hopeful for a part of the 20s. As they moved into the 30s, things changed quite radically, because at that stage we had complete separation from what would have been the United Kingdom at that stage, and there was a move to write a new constitution. And really, it was the writing of the Irish Constitution in the 1930s that changed things very fundamentally for women. And women in Ireland entered into a very, very dark period. So the Constitution was drafted primarily by a couple of civil servants who were strongly, they were advisors to, at the time, the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister. They would have been deeply religious. And the co-drafters of that were brought in were the patriarchs of the Catholic Church. So you had the archbishops, monsignors, and also the Church of Ireland Presbyterian and Methodist hierarchy. And in actual fact, when the Constitution was drafted, it was sent to the Vatican. Two drafts were sent to the Vatican for feedback and commentary before it was even presented to Parliament. So at that time, it was a very, very offensive move to primarily as well restrict the liberties of women and to curtail them. So a lot of things came in at that time. Women were denied access to jury service, the marriage bar, a ban on divorce, the Legitimacy Act, which essentially made children legitimate outside of marriage, a whole raft of measures that were vested in the Constitution, which put them beyond the reach of any subsequent government that would have come in. They wouldn't have had the authority to introduce legislation without a plebiscite. So the Constitution had to be approved by the people, and they adopted it. Now, it was a fairly small turnout and in relative terms, but it still managed to get a majority. And that Constitution really prevailed in Ireland right up in its entirety until the 70s. So you're looking at a whole period of time during which, we'll say, in other countries, as things were happening, maybe for women, progressing in different ways. They simply weren't happening in Ireland. So we did have a very small fledgling radical feminist movement in Ireland then in the 70s. It was short-lived for 2 or 3 years, and they had some small gains. But again, there was quite a bit of pushback against that. There was a National Council for the Status of Women was set up, and the outcome of that, of course, was that there was a sense that it was actually becoming too radical. So what happened as an outcome of that was that eventually it was assigned the status of an NGO, which made it more part of the establishment as opposed to being a separate entity. So once it became an NGO that worked with government as opposed to a standalone separate organization. So I say all that kind of by way of context, because anything that has happened in terms of feminist action over the last 20 or 30 years has necessitated collaboration in Ireland, in any case, with the right, because the whole power has been held there. And so we've had two parties that have exchanged majority power pretty much for the 100 years, with a few exceptions, a couple of rainbow coalitions where the Labour Party might have been a minor player. The Labour Party then has pretty much diminished over the last 10 or 15 years. So up until very recently, there would have been no visible left in Ireland. And certainly it's not something that would have been they weren't warm houses for women anyway. So women have always sort of had to operate outside of those structures. And women who have gone into politics, and we've seen that in the last 10 years, I suppose, more women in all of the political organizations and in all the political parties, to a certain degree, they have tried to exercise a certain amount of power from within to affect change within their own political parties. And that to some degree has allowed a more consensus-based approach to try and negotiate some of the more recent changes, if we look at things like the abortion legislation or that in the last number of years. So while sometimes there's an external view that Ireland is very progressive because we seem to have these populist movements, in many cases, all we have been doing is resetting the clock back to we'll say, for example, with the abortion referendum, in 1981, they put a clause into the Constitution which constitutionally barred any legislation for abortion provision. Now, that hadn't been in the Constitution, but it was, again, put into the Constitution in 1981. Removing that in 2018 was really just resetting the clock to 1980, to a time when it didn't exist anyway. And yet sometimes the perception that that was a hugely progressive achievement, when in many ways we had lost 30, 35 years during that time. So when you're looking against that backdrop of a very, very heavily religious and the theocracy superimposed on civil law, and any actions that have been taken by women over the last 10, 15 years have necessitated some degree of collusion with the right. However, in many ways, to answer your question, which I'm only doing now, it has never been something that has been used as an accusation until quite recently. So it was seen as pragmatic, it would have been opposed, but it hasn't been this idea that we are now colluding with and collaborating with the right is, in my opinion, a fairly recent framing of what it is that women are doing. Now, that may well be because there is more recent emergence of what appears to be more far-right sentiments, and therefore there is a certain cachet in being able to use that as a slur against your opponents. Well, I think one of the questions was about bipartisan work, and do you think that women can work in that way? And I think the starting point in many ways, I think, has to be feminism decoupling itself from the whole left-right axis in the first place. I mean, it's a redundant idea for us to plot ourselves along that spectrum, because it was a system that was designed by men for men, and by default it triages out women anyway. So I think that's the first exercise, is to entirely reprogram ourselves and how we approach looking at it, so that we don't fall into the trap of having to either offend or defend our position along an axis that actually has very little relevance to the work of feminism and to the work of women anyhow. I think a transitionary part of that, though, may well be, working in a bipartisan way. It certainly has been effective in some instances. And it's always quite interesting, as I said earlier, that heretofore that hasn't really been, it has been seen as being pragmatic, not an accusation of betrayal or a reason to reject something. So I think because we've kind of moved politically into a situation where our political opponents are no longer opponents, but they're seen as the enemy as opposed to the opponent, then we're in this situation where winning becomes the outcome by any means. And the idea of any sort of negotiation or concession is repugnant. And that's really kind of where we're at. So I think that shift from political opposition to political enemy has happened quite recently. And I think, but I also think, and because I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to try and pull a few things together. I think one of the things that is a big challenge for women is there is a political illiteracy. There's a political lack of understanding. And I think I'm looking at things even recently, we'll say even in Ireland, with our last general election, you had the green wave. So you had the climate change movement, you had the Greta Thunberg, you had the youth movement. And that naturally seemed to draw a lot of women into it, some of it from the, I suppose, the eco-feminist ethics of it and aspects of climate justice. So a lot of young people came out and automatically voted for the Green Party in Ireland without having any analysis, in actual fact, as to what the policies were of the Green Party, who turned out to be conservatively social and economically, to be socially and economically conservative and centrist right rather than centrist left. So even in the short period of time in the last year since they have formed part of the new coalition government, there has been a defection from the Green Party. And by a lot of younger people, and quite a number of them women. So I think that there is, somebody mentioned earlier, maybe it was Linda, or Sheila, the consciousness raising is a very, very important part of that moving forward. And I think, yes, I think bipartisan work has to be part of the transition to complete extrication from what is the political systems as we know them. If within the discussion of representative democracy, which exists and is a system within which we're still struggling, and there's a part of that has its role to play in the short term anyway, whatever short is. I think one of the radical changes that really needs to be made is in the parliamentary system, and moving from the idea of one person, one vote, to two people, two votes, to one person, two votes. So one man, one vote, to one person, two votes. And that where you have a parliamentary system, for example, just for example's sake, 100 seats in Parliament, that automatically 50% of those are for women and 50% for men. We've kind of bound ourselves up in this idea that we have to have a meritocracy of women in governance, and we must establish, we've got all these totally fallacious systems of quotas and trying to get women to move forward, to go forward as representatives, when in actual fact the starting point should be to colour code it in a very conventional ways. Half the seats should be blue and half of them should be pink, and you work backwards and see how you can fill them. You give somebody two, so you have two separate lists, and the justification for that is very simple. Half the population are men and half are women. So you don't need any of that. Is the meritocracy. The meritocracy is that half the population is men and women, and therefore half the seats in government must be. And then you work back and redesign your constituencies in ways that allow you to have two lists, pink lists, blue lists. I go out to vote. I fill my pink seats on my pink sheet and my blue ones from that. So I've got my two votes. We have a PR system here. I know it's different from
allow us to have 75% women.
That's my pitch in terms of sort of radical restructuring of existing parliamentary systems and representative systems.
Actually, what I said was that prevents us from having 75% women or 100% women, which would be great.
It does. It does. It does. There you go. I'm putting limitations already.
Yeah.